we collaborate with already mentioned Charles Bramble on that topic. It was rather recent discovery of one almost extinct tradition, ritual tradition from northeastern Tibet, which produced thousands of manuscripts which are hardly legible, and this makes it really rather complicated, and probably some long-term projects would be necessary to research it better. And Mark, can I? Yeah, thank you. Starting with general introduction. Of course, these non-Buddhist ritual traditions, as I prefer to call it ritual traditions, not religions. I get that there are some students of history of religions, and this is religion is rather problematic term, and what we know from Tibet that there was no religion in the sense of Christianity, Buddhism, or something like that, but something which would be better called ritual tradition. It was centered around the ritual and ritualists. And in case of Tibet, Tibetan history appears out of the mist roughly in the 7th century, when a huge Tibetan empire was created on the Tibetan plateau. And at similar time, Tibetan script was invented. And at that time, Tibet was, in the times before Central Tibet, was not bordering with China even. So we don't have any information about the religious traditions and anything of that kind. It is a coincidence that very soon after sudden creation of the Tibetan Empire, Buddhism was introduced to Tibet. It happened definitely in the 8th century, 100 years later. But it is quite likely that Tibetans knew something about Buddhism because almost all the surrounding countries where Buddhism was known there. And at the same time, with creation of the Tibetan Empire, we have indications that the indigenous or local Tibetan ritual traditions underwent some changes, that some pan-Tibetan religious tradition was in the process of formation. That religion focused definitely on the figure of Tibetan emperor. And such situation, which I try to briefly describe, leads to many difficulties when we speak about the non-Buddhist religion, because we have at the same time influence of Buddhism, creation of a new religious tradition, and then probably silent local ritual traditions which were scattered all over the Tibetan plateau. It's very difficult to distinguish what was influenced by Buddhism, what was the part of the imperial religion, and what was the local tradition somewhere. With invention of Tibetan script, it is many documents were written, and we have some documents from that imperial period of time, as we call it in Tibetan studies, which survived mostly among the so-called Dunhuang documents, which come from the famous cave known as a library to Tibetologists and Sinologists. And among large number of Tibetan scriptures which must be dated earlier than roughly half of the 11th century. There appear also documents which are related to the non-Buddhist religion. There are ritual manuals included there concerning mostly funeral rituals of high-standing people, but there appear also very beautiful myths which played a very important role in the non-Buddhist Tibetan ritual traditions. Nevertheless, there is a question because these manuscripts were written down, and underlying question is if this would represent some local ritual tradition, would it be subjected to writing? And the answer, which will probably never have clear answer to that, is that it is more likely that those written documents were probably part of that imperial religion, because the writing and the scriptures were likely part of it. It was devised for administrative purposes, but also for, let's say, ritual purposes of the empire. So it creates rather a complicated situation, and we must confess that we know almost nothing about the local variety of the ritual traditions and so on, because almost nothing comes to us. Now, allow me to say a few words about that, about some features of the non-Buddhist rituals. And we know more and more that that all across the Tibetan plateau, probably, there were some similarities in that ritual traditions, and there was a high importance of the myths on origin, which were pronounced during the ritual. And those myths on origin in Tibetan, they are called mostly mang, which is connected with the root, the verb ma, to speak, something which is spoken, which is pronounced. They apparently gave meaning to the ritual, and without that myth on origin, the ritual itself would be meaningless. We have some fine examples preserved among the Dunhuang documents. One of the finest, I would say, is a very long myth on origin of yak and horse. It is very poetic text, although it has been translated into English by Thomas in the 1950s. I think the translation doesn't correspond to the beauty of the original. It's a very difficult text, and I don't think I wouldn't dare to translate, but from the text itself, it seemed very, very poetic. And it's recently it was shown by Brandon Dodson that in fact it is not a folk tale as it was considered by Thomas, but it's that myth on origin which speaks about the origin not of horse in general, but of horse which was used during the funeral ritual, who was sort of psychopomp for the deceased, and the horse carried him to other world place of gods and so on. We have in another examples, we have simply short sort of catalogs. It has been called by Rolstan that instead of longer, fine poetic myth, there appeared just lists of countries, priests, demonic beings, and so on. And it shows that such myths can be abbreviated into very, very short, not even story, just a list of names and persons. And it can be at the same time extended to very large and poetic narration. And quite puzzling is also that when we see the records which somehow touch the ritual specialists, non-Buddhist ritual specialists, which are called Bon or Shen, we don't know what exactly was the difference between them. The Shen is mostly translated as priest, and Bon, it's left untranslated. The word born is etymologically probably related to the verb to pronounce. So it could get one to pronounce the bits for the ritual test. Nevertheless, the term which is connected with that special pronunciation of ritual and the myth on origin is in Tibetan Gyer. And it's very specific. It's never used in connection with Buddhist chanting or with reading aloud. It's a specific term. In some later sources from Bon religion, monastic Bon religion, totally different tradition, which is one which would be labeled briefly as unorthodox Buddhism, with certain simplifications. In their sources from 14th century, is described that this year, that this pronouncing of origin myths was done in a way that it imitated animal voices. There were voices of birds, tiger, horse, and so on. And certain type of origin myth, for certain types of origin myths, certain kind of voice should be used. This survives somehow probably in the famous tradition of chanting, Buddhist tradition of chanting tantric texts, where it repeats in some texts that this is the way how they imitate voices, animal voices. This term here is used in some in a Bon or monastic Bon religion for that kind of chanting. And also in other schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And this is quite striking because we can suppose that using those voices which imitate animals and birds and so on, made the performance incomprehensible for people. And it's quite likely that what mattered the most was the communication, the ritualist spirits and divinities. And we know from some documents surviving in Dunhuang and others that sometimes these myths on origin were organized into large compendia, and there appeared in fact a long series of these myths, and this is typically called rap in Tibetan, like a myth from the series of them. And I will touch upon the topic a bit later. We know quite clearly that the ritual was seen as an reenactment of the original events which took place in the mythical past or during the origin of the world. Because some of these myths, they end up with a phrase which is repeated as it was beneficial in the past, may be beneficial in the present time. And this ritual, when briefly described, some of these rituals, they seem to be practical means of solving problems. They definitely contain something what would be called magical elements, and I don't know, the old concept of sympathetic magic. But there are no signs of sort of trance or deity possession. So the label you can find in literature that was shamanistic religion, that there were people of the time, we don't have proof for that. And lineages of quite frequently, these texts mention mythical priests, and one of them in Dunhuang documents mentioned is certain Shenra Mewo, who later becomes the founding figure of the monastic Bon religion. And concerning these priests, Shen, we don't know exactly if they were really human beings, because in some sources, some sources clearly speak about the Namshen, heavenly priest. So it's, in some cases, it could be taken as a mythical figure of some primordial priest, ritualist. And it seems to be likely that they were crucial for forming various ritual lineages in imperial Tibet and later on. And following this very general introduction, I would like to present some examples of that, because you can touch it much better through some example. And as an example, I would use texts which were found not from Dunhuang document, but texts which were found in southern Tibet in Gathang Bumpa Stupa. It was in 2000 something that they were reconstructing old stupa in that region, and during the reconstruction, one of the workers found inside the stupa apparently old texts. He realized that those are not Buddhist texts at all, and sent them to Lhasa, to Pasang Wandu, who is Tibetologist specialists on also imperial times. He immediately recognized that it's very old, and it's totally without Buddhist terminology almost. And he published these texts in Lhasa later on. This is the publication, and among those texts appear a collection of ritual texts. We don't know what is exactly the date, but it's usually in the literature it's estimated that it should be earlier than 11th century. The script resembles that of Dunhuang documents, and as I said, there appears almost no Buddhist terminology in it. And among those scriptures appears also a collection of ritual texts, including the myth on origin, which are dealing with a very sinister topic, and it's a sort of purification rituals which are concerning very specific cases of untimely dead pregnant women, which was seen as something very dangerous and is seen even nowadays. And fortunately, there appears also a collection of 14 origin myths or antecedent myths, because in this case, it doesn't start with origin of the world and so on, but it's situated in some mist of the past and also the localities. And it seems that it forms a complete collection of such myths. This is quite unique because in the Dunhuang documents, we don't have a complete, almost no complete collections. There are fragments, series of myths. So we don't know what was the beginning, what was the structure of that collection. And just as an example, there is the third myth. I will not read it probably, but you can read it. I will just briefly narrate the content. Typically, it starts with the name of the father, of the place, of the mother, and it lists boy and girl who were born. And the main character of this myth is called Goza Chamdharma in this. And it says that he was very beautiful, and as a consequence, all the spirits and demons, gods of the valley fell in love with her. And they asked her father to marry her, but he refused. And it turned out that one of the demons living in the valley, she loved him somehow. And the text says the father made a mistake. He was stubborn and made a mistake. He didn't give her to giving her, and to the heart of the girl was broken, separated from her beloved spirit. Let's say. Anyway, she was married to another wali, to a man from another wali, and after 9 months, means she was pregnant, she traveled to visit her father. And traveling there, she met two herders of goats and sheep. And they asked her who you are. She answered, my name is my father, and so on. And suddenly one of the herders of goats, they screamed and Goza Chamdharma fell down and fainted. And they threw the stone, and the stone hit her head. Her leg got stuck in halter, then it fell down. And she strangled a while. And as a consequence, as a result, she died 9 times. And as a result, 9 demons were inside the body. And this required some ritual treatment and purification. And it was performed. The purification ritual was performed by one of the specialists, mythical specialist, who is called Jibon Rajak Kigel. Jibon was a Bonist specialist and deep, specializing on demons deep. And Rajak Kigel is his name. And now we have briefly described the ritual. He erected 9 cans of tree. He prepared 9 birds' heads for some ritual height, and 9 holes, 9 skins. And from the description, it's clear that he used 9 paths through which demons dig, causing the death or associated with the death were let out of the body. This next slide. And so the text, the myth concludes that the demons were tamed and pacified, and she was washed by many liquids. And she was placed to the right side of the tomb of Zankar Serupa, her husband. And she was, during the ritual, she was transformed into the man king, which is one of the spirits known in Tibet, frequently associated with lakes and we can see the concluding phrase: benefit and merit were thus brought in the ancient time. Benefit and merit are brought even now by reciting this narration. And coming to this collection of myths as a whole, fortunately, some of the localities mentioned there could be put on the map. And when we do it, we can associate with them the mythical priests. That it's usually in the myth, it appears. It says at the beginning, it mentions the locality, and then during the myth, certain priests, spiritual specialists appear. And we can make such a list, and it appears that almost all the places which could be identified and are mentioned in the text come from central Tibet or South Tibet. Nothing comes from northern Tibet, eastern Tibet, western Tibet. It's sort of tradition of this region. And when we inspect the next slide, the description of the ritual used, which is very briefly mentioned in this text, we come to conclusion that it varies, that is highly variable, that there was no one single tradition of ritual treatment of that particularly displayed. But in fact, there were a number of traditions, and I will not go to detail, but here you have some examples that they treat the ritual performed differently according to something. Please next slide, Mark. And when we take a look into those myths, it appears that myth, which would be numbered 8 to 13, contains very similar phrases in the middle of the myth. It says it doesn't matter. And in the 13th myth, it is said clearly that the 6th chapter has concluded. And from this, we can deduce that actually this was originally self-contained part of these myths. And then in the myths, which could be numbered 1 to 5, it mentions exclusively ritualist g.yang, and it also displays some similarity. And it's quite likely that this was another originally self-contained collection of myths on origin. And it is thus seen that, this particular collection of myths was formed from original, probably local collections connected with certain groups. It was put together. Almost all the myths are of similar length, so it was probably somehow edited. And formally, it is very similar. It starts with the place, name of father, and so on. The main events come, and then the ritualist appears, and the ritual is briefly described. And we don't have much time, but using some Dunhuang documents, old Dunhuang documents, we can see that some documents which contain the short list, which were of priests, which were originally, which served as a myth on origin, that in several cases we have, it is quite similar, that it concerns the central Tibet and all the regions which go beyond the territories of northern Tibet, eastern Tibet, western Tibet, are just associated either with some mythical lands, or are just called eastern Tibet Dog. That we have number of particular localities in central Tibet, and all the vast regions which come to the east are called Dog and are part of the whole. We can see also that if you remember what I said about the part of that region, it might be likely that these were the ways how this region was formed. The local tradition that somehow together, something was silent, and some lineages of the priests became more important. And in number of documents, we can see that there was certain divide between central Tibet and the rest of the territories in Tibet. When looking into Dai's divination manuals, which contain the largest number of spirits, divinities, and so on, it becomes apparent that they contain spirits and divinities, local divinities from various regions of Tibet. So it was Dai's divination, which would also be representing the imperial region, but somehow compound version from various local sources. There appeared even the Turkic divinities, Chinese divinities, and divinities from Western Tibet and from Eastern Tibet. In some cases, again, it's mentioned. So it seems that these traditions would not be just mirroring some one single local regional tradition, but certain process of putting them together took place there. And yeah, this is what I briefly said. Now I will proceed to the second part. I don't know what time. Hope we are not very late. Yeah, 15 minutes. Okay, I will come to some example, the topic which I'm researching and which I mentioned earlier. It's an example of a sort of ritual tradition or something enigmatic, which is called Leu in Tibetan. And which probably there are some indications that it could represent some Eastern tradition, Eastern Tibetan, it's connected with some Eastern Tibetan ritual tradition. And to start with this topic, I should say that in the Buddhist chronic, which were written later than 13th century, so it's relatively old, there appear some standard narration about the pre-Buddhist past of Tibet. And as a part of it, it is mentioned that at the time before Buddhism, Tibet was ruled by Jung, Deu, and Burn. Jung is clearly stories, narration. Deu is not that clear, but it's usually rendered as riddles, and it makes scholars were wondering what this could be, ruled by riddles. And the last one is Burn. Burn, we have now Burn region of Tibet, but in the earlier sources, this Burn meant clearly ritual. That it was. However, in his book on Gesar epic, Rothstein was probably the only one who noticed that. He pointed out that in some Tibetan texts there appears alternative version of that Deu, which is translated riddle, which is written down as Leu differently. And normally Leu means in Tibet section, division, or chapter in book. But this is apparently not the case. And it was clear to Rothstein. But Rothstein understood that he still related it to that Deu, that according to him, it could be corresponding to, it could be related to expression Leudon, which corresponds to Lenden, to answer a question, and it could relate alternating songs which are present in the folk religion and so on. But I don't think that he was right in this point. And next slide, please. And it was also Rothstein who pointed out to several mentions of this Leu in Buddhist texts, one of them in 14th century Gyalpo Katang. And it's in the given part, it speaks about the treasures which were concealed in one of the holiest Buddhist temple, Ramoche, in Dunhuang Ramoche in Lhasa. And it says that, it was hidden, and all what is listed are texts. And among the texts appear Leu, which is quite puzzling and confusing. And but for Rothstein, because it mentions also Jungbum, collection of Jung, it could be related to that Buddhist chronicles who speak about the ruling by Jung, Deu, and Burn. So he took it that this Leu could be something similar to Deu. It is quite puzzling, and fascinating, because this text is from 14th century, so it's relatively late. But it speaks about the beginnings of literacy of one of the holiest temples, and it mentions inventor of Tibetan script, inventor Tonmi Sambhota, that he presented these books to the emperor, and they were the first books which were written down in Tibet and then later concealed in that holy temple of Karamoche. Then we have another reference, and it's not sure. In another reference, Rolstan speaks about Gesar epic and description of horse races, and there the text mentions a performer of Leu Duken, and Stan considered it because he still saw it the part of the narration of the stories of triad stories, Leu or Deu and Wen. And so he corrected the reading that it was probably Leu Junken, the one who narrates Leu stories. But apparently he was wrong because Leu Junken, with what we know now, makes perfect sense. Performer of Leu tradition, of Leu. Please, next. And then we have another Buddhist source, and it's not clear if it's really related to that Leu. It speaks about the time of 8th century in imperial Tibet, an important Tibetan king known as Tisong Deutsen. And it says that during his ancestors, some tradition which is called Leute, and which is Chinese, brought benefit to his ancestors and so on, and he should follow. And it's mentioned as Leute, Leukete, and Rolstan, who again noticed it, was not sure if he was a sinologist, unlike me. He read Chinese very well, but he didn't come to some conclusion what it could be in Chinese. Leukete. Anyway, what's important, we have some references in Buddhist texts about certain Leu. Then in Tibetan studies, there was long silence since 1959. Nobody just took up the topic of Leu. And recently in 2020, in a monumental 2 volumes written by Tony Huber, which were published in Austria with the title Source of Life, which contain enormous material collected in Bhutan, in eastern Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh, and associated with the village ritualists and village ritualists. He writes about certain Leu Gu, 9 Leu. It must be said that later on we will see that this Leu is alternatively written down as Legu, and apparently it's something the same meant in the text. Even a single text, both variants are mentioned, but it's written no. For Tony Huber, he presents an argument that in this region, Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh, Leu means really, it's a technical term for certain ritual, which has 9 steps, and Gu means 9. And he uses a 15th century source, Sheto Yishin Norbu, which is somehow, I don't know, unusual source because it could be related to the monastic Bon religion. But it apparently wants to be an orthodox source. So it calls, instead of Yundunben, it calls it Yuruben. And I must say that, again, I will see earlier sources, and I'm not convinced by that explanation by Tony Huber. Now, it is quite recently that certain Leu tradition, which is called, I don't know, it has a meaning, it is used today as a Leu tradition. Leu could be a term for ritual specialist, the Leu person and the Leu tradition, which is almost extinct was prevalent in some region in eastern Tibet, in regions which are nowadays in Sichuan and Gansu provinces, and roughly in the Minshan mountain range. And of course, until the Cultural Revolution was living there, but it was in the past persecuted by monks of one religion or Buddhist tradition living there, because they apparently performed animal sacrifices and so on. And from what we know from the history nowadays, the times of persecution were changed for the time when they lived in some symbiosis, and they divided with Bumpa monks their ritual roles and so on. And as a result, this tradition is almost extinct, but it was a colleague of mine, Professor Ngawang Gyatso, who is a professor in Lanzhou University, who comes from that region, who first pointed out, who collected the texts and wrote an article in Tibetan about the Leu tradition. It was not much noticed in the West because it was published in the local journal in Amdo. And since that time, we have a large number of these ritual texts surviving in the households in the region were published and collected. And apparently nowadays I traveled to that region and I did some field work before the pandemic, and nowadays it seems impossible to go there because almost rather remote region, and I can't imagine traveling there and conducting field research. But I was able to be there with Ngawang Gyatso, and we visited two surviving old ritualists who were more than one of them 86 at the time, and the second one more than 90 years old. And we were able to interview them a bit about that tradition. Nowadays, there are younger ritualists who are trying to perform the ritual, but when talking to them, they confessed that they do it mechanically and they actually don't know how to perform the rituals correctly, just chanting texts like Buddhists were. And okay, so you have some pictures from the ritual dedicated to the warrior divinity chant. We worship there because this region was quite troublesome, and armed conflicts were quite common in the past here, and it's associated with fighting for warrior divinities. And another feature which will be important in the last part of my talk is that this region is somehow, and Professor Marc Desjardins told me that he asked me to read my text concerning Nien and Nienbum I'm not speaking about now, but it's quite striking that the that the cult of certain spirits which are called Nien is widespread there. Almost all the mountains are considered to be Nien. Nien spirits are known all across the Tibet, but when you ask Tibetan, you would hardly knows what it exactly is. Nien means something very dangerous. For example, that COVID was called Nientok. It figures in medical literature, and it represents Nien stand behind some diseases which demonstrate themselves some something like that. And besides that, Nien means something dangerous and powerful. And okay, so this is the region of the Mingshan mountain range, and from this region, the manuscripts come. You can see it's not far, not that far, changing. And then the list of the manuscript published. Next slide, please. And now 100 volumes of that reproductions of that manuscript were published, and we are right now other 30 volumes are in press, others are being prepared. Unfortunately, some of these manuscripts are totally unreadable. That it's written down phonetically, and it's in many cases it's impossible to read them and to know what the content. There are some manuscripts which are better in this regard that could be read with some effort. And needless to say, these manuscripts contain typically myths on origin. So there is a long continuity with the non-Buddhist tradition from imperial times. And Mark, you know, the term Leu is quite puzzling, and it led me to look into the Bumpa sources, and which it was for me personally quite surprising that I found quite many references about Leu in mostly in the Bumpa sources, which could be dated from 12th, 14th century. And surprisingly, there appeared not much references about some Leu tradition or Leu rituals, but it was abundant with mentions about certain Leu divinities and Leula. And I will present only short selection of these sources. One of these texts, allegedly written by 12th or 13th century author Asha Lodu Gathang Bumpa Master. The name Asha is a locality in eastern Tibet, which I just point out of interest. He's an author of a very boring list of transgression, which is repeated then in the Bumpa literature and even in the Buddhist literature. And in this list, please, I will not read it because it's really Leu divinities are mentioned, and the Tibetan text says that Joe Leu Halo, which could be rendered as you know, that could be punished. That is one of the crimes, abandoning or rejection of the, let's say, entrusted Leu divinity. And this sentence appears in the list in between of family matters. It speaks about the wine and betrayal of the community of patrilineal. So it's apparently meant as being something related to family matters, these Leu divinities. And I will show that I think it should translate it differently. And another example, there is a 14th century collection of enormous literature in 14 volumes. It contains a story about a certain king and queen, and the queen became ill, and the illness, important, was caused by a loose spirit. The loose spirit is underground spirit. In Buddhist literature, it's somehow merged with Indian Nagas, something indigenous. And this loose spirit caused the illness. And this text translation you have here, it contains the conclusion of that story. And in that conclusion, it says that you know, the ritualist is invited and cure the disease. And it now speaks that it was the diviner recognized that it was caused by the Leu divinity. So we can conclude that the loose spirit is also Leu divinity. And next slide, please. Then we have another source which was written definitely before 14th century, because it's mentioned in the 14th century source, and it is unorthodox unorthodox scripture, and it again contains a mention of Leu, and it suddenly speaks about Leu tradition, the meaning is a rather rare meaning. And why I'm mentioning it here, because it's in the story there appear various ritualists, and they are organized according to the point of compass. And when those of ask the mythical founder of Bon, monastic Bon religion, Shenrab Miwo, who will be the teacher after his demise and so on, he says that that it will be friends and so on, and at the time the Bon of Legu, which is the alternative name for Leu, of 10 knowledges will be enacted, and the specific way of recitation will be passed on in each tradition of original narration. So clearly reference to this tradition, and it speaks about it. Next slide, please. And then we have the source, 12th to 13th century Nyen collection, and it contains, it speaks about the owners of Leu divinities, and those are those ritualists that they are owners, Leu Hada, the term in Tibetan. And the text clearly speaks that these Leu divinities are Sadak, Lu, and Nyen. So it confirms that Lu are included as a Leu divinities. And we don't have much time, so next slide. And when just searching for, it's very chaotic, and one doesn't know how to make sense of this. Leu is quite enigmatic. But eventually I came to a references when searching for some meanings of the expression Leu, that in some medical texts, the Leu is said to be an expression for fetus. And suddenly, after the field research that region where the Leu rituals perform Leu rituals, it became clear, or I recollected that I was told by the old ritualists that they mainly worship Lu and Nyen spirits. And many people, including Nawang Gyatso, the original name of Nyen, and only the Nawang Gyatso given by the monk, many people have the Nyen in their name, and because when the couple doesn't have a child or baby, they perform a ritual and ask the Nyen or Lu to bring the baby. And suddenly it became clear that it makes somehow sense that these are divinities. They are divinities who are granting children, who bring children, and these are namely in these regions the underground spirits associated with women in the region, and the Nyen, quite often divinities of mountains associated with males and with men. And the next slide, and it's okay, it's the hypothesis I just and concluding remark. So through that case of the Leu tradition, I wanted to illustrate quite difficult and puzzling background of ritual tradition, because you might recollect that I mentioned that this Leu as a term appears in the literature in the Bumpa sources from 12th to 4th century quite frequently. But we don't have, I didn't find any older mention from Dunhuang documents, and again, we don't know what to do with it. And is it so that some indigenous tradition transformed into something which became called or associated with that Leu divinities cult? By extension, those specialists who performed rituals with Leu divinities became called Leu specialists, and it gave also names to the tradition, Leu tradition. And it is quite likely, since the Nyen appear mostly in eastern Tibet, the homeland of originally Dong clan, although now we have members of different clans, and that it was somehow connected with the tradition which would be localized and specified as the tradition of Dong people, which were widespread in the region. Anyway, it's clear that there is a diversity of, and I will mention the term used of by Charles Tremble, was here 2 years ago, and he's using this term pagan religion. It sounds quite, it might sound funny, but I think it's fitting in Tibetan context, and in the sense that in Latin, pagus means regional politics, the regional, local variants of some, in this case, ritual tradition. On the one hand, there is a still remaining stress on the important role of origin myths, which is a sign of a long continuity. But at the same time, apparently, from what we know from the text of that Leo tradition from Eastern Tibet, that it's impossible to trace back the changes it went over during the centuries. Anyway, non-Buddhist traditions have impact on religious ideas even today, and it is not much seen through the surface of the Buddhist, omnipresent Buddhist traditions. And we can observe that in Buddhist environment, there are many indigenous rituals preserved, rituals sung of burning juniper every day by Gathang Tibet, or rituals like the so-called ransom offering ritual, where the effigy from effigy is presented instead of, let's say, seekers. And in these cases, Buddhists usually what they do that they erase, they delete the myth, and the result is that the ritual doesn't make much sense. And in some cases, Buddhists supply instead of that myth so-called semi-history of that myth, and which is usually associated with Buddha or mythical or Buddhist great figures like Padmasambhava or Chisong Delsen, and through that they attempt to propagate Buddhism. So this was the last words, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, very good. Okay, now it's the question period, but we will start with those that are online. That is because that would be difficult for the question period. So what we'll do is that we'll